Today's lecture, we're going to be talking about 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians may be the most fascinating thing we've dealt with so far because within this single letter, we have at least 2 letters, according to most scholars, with possibly more. So when you read through 2 Corinthians, pay real close attention to where the letter breaks, or if, as you're reading, if you feel like something is disjointed, pay real close attention to that, because it might be exactly that. We believe that 2 Corinthians is at least 2 letters that have been put together by a later editor to make it feel somewhat like a single letter. It also might have been the fact that as these letters were collected and sent as multiple letters, these were pieces of papyri that would be stacked on top of each other if there were multiple letters, and they were sent as several letters at a time, just like the canonization process we already talked about maybe back in week 1. Well, this might be exactly that, and so when the manuscripts or these letters were getting old and the next person had to copy them, he didn't realize that there were 2 letters, there was just one, so he put them all on the same page or wrote them all together. So that might be one reason why 2 Corinthians has 2 letters in it. It also might be that there are several letters that Paul wrote, and a later editor put them together purposefully to make more sense together and make it a little bit easier for 2 Corinthians to circulate. So as we read through 2 Corinthians, as we go through this lecture, just pay real close attention to the fact that 2 Corinthians is actually letters in a letter. But before we start talking about 2 Corinthians in particular, in these divisions in the letter, or how the letter's divided up, let's talk about Paul's authority, because we haven't spent a lot of time on this. Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about being an apostle that was untimely born, and the one who Jesus appeared to last. He certainly wasn't a part of the 12 disciples. He comes to faith later, according to his own autobiographical sections in some of his letters. He persecuted this early Jesus movement, and then had a revelation of Jesus that changed the way he thought and believed. And that may be the nature of people's doubt about Paul. Where did he get this authority to preach the gospel? Who authorized it? All those questions are in play in this early Jesus movement. And remember, there's nobody really in charge. There's no top-down structure that says who's right and who's wrong. They're trying to figure it out in real time. And Paul, we think of Paul as a huge authority figure now because these letters are in the New Testament and they are authoritative scripture for us. But while these letters were being written, Paul is trying to create authority, trying to get authority or claim authority over. And all this is being negotiated, especially among those who he considers his opponents. In Galatia, in the letter to the Galatians, he talks about these opponents as men from James. These were more Jewish or conservative believers that he disagreed with. And we don't know that the people he's disagreeing with in the Corinthian correspondence is the same kind of group or a different kind of group or individuals. So there's a lot of diversity, a lot of discussion in early Christianity, or disagreement in early Christianity, about who's in charge and who has the authority to say what was the true gospel of Jesus Christ. And 1 Corinthians shows that Paul's authority is being challenged for sure. We already talked about that in the last session. But the question is, if 1 Corinthians was successful in showing Paul's authority over his opponent, why would Paul have to write a follow-up letter like 2 Corinthians, especially 2 Corinthians chapter 10 through 13. So these letters themselves, the fact that there is a 2 Corinthians shows that some or many in Corinth did not accept Paul's authority. In fact, there's evidence in 2 Corinthians that when Paul returned, he was publicly humiliated by someone in the church itself, which is why he leaves. It's pretty intense. We'll talk about this a little bit later. But just know that Paul's authority is utterly challenged, even within this congregation that he helped start. 2 Corinthians 3:1 says, are we, and this is Paul writing, are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Surely we do not need to, as some do, letters of recommendation from you, do we? And the answer to that is he's saying we don't, but he's certainly voicing some concern that people may think that Paul has to have some kind of letter of recommendation before he can come back. But that's, chapter 3 is set within a really nice section of 2 Corinthians. In chapter 10:8, 2 Corinthians chapter 10:8, it's a fundamentally different kind of story, and that's where he goes, now even if I boast a little too much of our authority, I will not be ashamed of it. So there he's just adamantly arguing that he absolutely and emphatically has authority to write these letters chastising the community or the church there in Corinth. So Paul's authority is utterly challenged, and 2 Corinthians and the letters contained in it show his response to that. So 2 Corinthians is at least 2 letters in one, and this piece of paper that you're seeing here, or this on the screen, is a copy from P46. It's the earliest manuscript that we have of 2 Corinthians, and it's a part of a compilation of his letters that circulated in the 2nd century. The script that you see there is Greek, and it's handwritten, as you can see, as all things were at that time. But it's not super nice. I mean, they didn't realize that they weren't trying to be as careful as others in making this perfect scripture. Unlike sections of the Old Testament that scribes painfully copy down to make sure there's no error. So let's look at 2 Corinthians as an edited letter. There is the 2-letter theory, and this is nothing more than a theory that 2 Corinthians chapter 1 through chapter 9 is a letter of celebration or a letter of conciliatory praise. It's a good section. Paul's very happy. He's congratulating them. And then in chapter 10 through 13, it really turns abruptly into a letter of scorn. So this is exactly why scholars believe that there's 2 letters put into one here, and that this second section, chapter 10 through 13, was actually written first. And it was this is the painful letter, and it had the effective results, so that the church in Corinth received this short letter from Paul. It was very painful. They listened to him and changed their ways, which is why he wrote another letter, at least, and that would be chapter 1 through 9, his celebration of the fact that they turned. And then somebody later took these 2 letters and put them together as such. Now there's another theory where the multiple letter theory, and this is where some argue that there are at least, well, there are several letters within this section. So chapter 1 through 6, chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 13, and chapter 7 verse 2 through 16, that is the original conciliatory letter that Paul wrote, thanking them for turning back to him. And then people believe that because this little, very small section, which is chapter 6, 14 through 7:1, it seems to interrupt the letter. So as you're reading, check this little section out in particular, because some people think that this is such a sharp interruption to the flow of the letter, and it contains material that's found nowhere else in any of Paul's writings. those are the two reasons people feel like this may have been a very short letter that was written later, maybe by someone else, and it was inserted here, or that it's just another letter that Paul wrote. But it's such an interruption, and the material is so fundamentally different. Scholars think that this might be a small letter within the larger letter of chapter 1 through chapter 6, 13, and chapter 7, 2 through 16. So there's two letters, at least. Here, chapter 8, 1 through 24, there's a letter regarding an offering for Corinth. This seems to be its own section. And chapter 9, 1 through 15, is a letter regarding an offering for another church. So some scholars would argue that there's at least 4 letters within chapter 1 through chapter 9, and then chapter 10 through chapter 13 is this letter of pain. So the multiple letter theory has at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters within 2 Corinthians. The 2-letter theory only says that there's 2. It's really hard to parse out all 5 of those, and you just have to assume that there are multiple letters and you have to find them. But there is good reason to ask these questions, because chapter 8 and chapter 9 are very similar. They are so similar, it makes it a little odd that they follow each other. And then chapter 6, 14 through 7, 1 does seem like an interruption. So there are some problems with how that flows, but at the very least, scholars feel very comfortable with the fact that chapter 10 through chapter 13 is another letter completely. So let's talk about this correspondence timeline, and based on how 2 Corinthians flows, and you can read it for yourself. I'll argue, along with Bart Ehrman, the author of the book that's our textbook for this class, that there's at least 2 letters within 2 Corinthians. So we have 1 Corinthians and we have 2 Corinthians, which is 2 letters. So there's at least 3 letters that we have from Paul to this church at Corinth. So let's look at that timeline together, or timeline of Paul's life with the Corinthians. He initially starts the assembly, the church there. It looks like he's there for about a year and a half, based on some material in Acts. We don't know that for sure. That's why it's kind of a question mark there. But Paul eventually leaves Corinth and goes to Ephesus, and it's from Ephesus that he writes 1 Corinthians. Now, look at 2 Corinthians 1:19 as a reference to him being in Ephesus. That's the only reason that's on there. But he writes 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. I'm sorry, let me back up. He certainly writes 1 Corinthians from Ephesus, but he leaves Corinth and goes to Ephesus. And while he's in Ephesus, he writes his first letter to the Corinthians, which we can see in 1 Corinthians 5:9. But this letter is lost to history. We do not have this letter at all, unless it's maybe embedded in 2 Corinthians in one of those multiple letter theories. I don't think that's the case, and neither does Ehrman. So Paul's at Ephesus. He writes his first letter to the Corinthians, but that letter is lost to history. And he writes that letter, and then he receives a report from Chloe's people, and a letter from the leaders at Corinth. At least 3 men from the Corinthian church come, and they deliver that letter. And it's in response to this report from Chloe's people and a letter from these 3 men that Paul finally writes what we have as 1 Corinthians. And he writes 1 Corinthians to deal with these specific issues. So what happens after that? So Paul gets a report, he gets a letter from Corinth, he writes another letter, which we have in 1 Corinthians. And then it looks like Paul returns to Corinth after he writes this letter. And he calls this a painful trip in 2 Corinthians 2, 1 through 4. And it looks like Paul was publicly humiliated there and not treated well on this return to Corinth. And read this for yourselves in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. He has this terrible trip that didn't work out well for him. He looks like he's publicly humiliated. And then he leaves. And when he leaves, it looks like these people he calls super apostles arrive and speak against Paul. And they were Jewish, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So it's a Jewish contingent that were anti-Paul, came and spoke to this Corinthian church. Now, this kind of begs the question, are these the same kind of people that came from James and went to the churches in the church in Antioch that's recorded in the letter to the Galatians and argued against Paul's gospel there? We don't know. All we know is that, according to 2 Corinthians, these were Jewish followers of Jesus. And he calls them super apostles. And we don't know if he's kind of making fun of them or whether they are literally called super apostles, which sounds like they would have more authority than Paul. And he is in a heated leadership vacuum. I mean, this is a real issue of who is the church in Corinth going to listen to, Paul or these others who vehemently disagree with him. Well, Paul writes a scathing letter and sends it with Titus to Corinth, and this is 2 Corinthians chapter 10 through 13, which we think is an original letter. And it's such a hot letter. He scolds him so bad that we think that it had the results that Paul wanted. So while Titus was there, he delivers this letter. It looks like the church, upon receipt of this letter, is kind of cut to the core and turns back to Paul's teaching. So he gets that response. He hears back from Titus that indeed his little letter worked, and then he writes his fourth letter to the Corinthians, rejoicing in their change of heart. And this is 2 Corinthians chapter 1 through 9. Go ahead and look at chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, and then chapter 7, 5 through 16 in particular, where he's kind of rejoicing that they've come back to him. So there's your timeline. That's what we think, how many letters he actually wrote to the Corinthians, and we believe that two of those are contained within 2 Corinthians. So what are the main points in this composite? Now, I put this down. This is the last couple of lines of Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which I find it just really fascinating to kind of compare Dr. King's letter to other clergy in Birmingham to Paul's letters to Corinth, because Dr. King is certainly marching for civil rights. He's in jail. He went through this hard time, and in the face of that kind of pressure, local white clergy people from Birmingham write a pretty nasty letter to the editor of a newspaper in Birmingham about why they agreed with Dr. King that civil rights needed to happen and that things were wrong, but they disagreed with Dr. King's tactics in the civil rights movement. What's fascinating about the letter to Birmingham jail, Dr. King writes this letter, some of it from prison. He smuggles it out in toilet paper with the people who came to see him, and then after he gets out, he really sits and puts some time into this and works on a strong letter. And he basically responds to every accusation that these white clergy people wrote against him, and he responds to it in a very long, it's about 6 pages, the letter. It's a fantastic letter. One of the seminal documents came out of the civil rights era. But here you have clergy people arguing about the way to fight for justice, right? It's really interesting to look at Paul and his letters to the Corinthians in relation to that, because Paul is in the battle of his life, and there are other clergy people who fundamentally disagree with him, and it is a matter of life and death in a lot of cases in this early Christian movement. So it's just, I always find that fascinating, and I love the letter for Birmingham jail. It was a formative piece of literature for me. But look, what are the main points in this composite work? The vast majority of the letter, chapter 1 through 9, is a conciliatory response to the Corinthians' return to Paul's teachings. Chapter 8 and 9 are really interesting because chapter 8 is an encouragement to generosity. Chapter 9 is an encouragement to give an offering to others. Either of those are, the argument is that those might be letters of them by themselves, but I think they're probably all together in chapters 1 through 9. And then chapter 10 through 13 is a serious warning against the Corinthians turning away from Paul and his teaching. And there, I gave you chapter 12, verse 11. Paul argues, he's like, "Have I been a fool? You forced me to it. Indeed, you should have been the ones commending me, for I'm not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I'm nothing." So spend some time reading 2 Corinthians. I think you may find this very interesting. I hope that's the case. It certainly is the case for me. In any case, spend some time with the letter and see how that matches up with the reading from the textbook and the letter itself.